just relaxed and paying attention.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronymus. My executive producer and research assistants, Laura Kortner, and engineer is Anita Brockington. Oh, boy, tonight. There they go. Tonight, we are talking to Jim Willis. We're talking about lost civilizations, the secret histories and suppressed technologies of the ancients, Visible Ink Press, and written by, of course, Jim Willis.net. Oh, gosh, Rudy. I have so many other questions. I don't know if we're going to get to them. So let me give you this one here.
Okay.
The fundamentalist is one who accepts the so-called fundamentals of the faith and then shuts his or her mind to any other possibilities. In this case, the fundamentalist couldn't answer some nagging problems that refused to be swept under the academic rug. Today, the Christian fundamentalists want to eliminate the separation of church and state. What would your response be to that, sir?
Well, I have a hard time with labels. It's hard to to talk about fundamentalist and put a fundamentalist or an evangelical or a liberal or something into a camp, because I have known fundamentalists who wouldn't even want to consider such a thing, and I've known other fundamentalists who want to declare martial law whenever they can. So I really can't say that fundamentalists believe this or fundamentalists believe that. And it's changing so much too, and also it's not just a religious term anymore. There are fundamentalists in the scientific community who accept certain fundamentals of science and who refuse to acknowledge anything else. And there are fundamentalists in politics nowadays who accept certain tenets, and in order to be in our club, you've got to be this, and that. I think it's dangerous whenever we close our minds. Engaging people in conversation, engaging people in discussion, and even engaging people in arguments doesn't have to be a matter of proving one person is right and one person is wrong. I think that's the danger of it. And simply talking to someone doesn't mean you necessarily agree with them. I think the important thing is, and this is it's so important, I think, for our time, having studied so much in the archaeological community about archaeologists who just wouldn't accept anything else except for their interpretation of a particular historical site or their particular historical thing. Having been in academia where certain people would standing up and a student would question, and this is where Charles Hapgood was so wonderful, Professor Hapgood. When anybody opened a question in his class, he was the first to say, hey, let's explore this, rather than, no, that's not the way it is. I'm the expert, so you know. So I guess that's kind of a long way around your question, but it's something I think we have to guard against. Well, we all have to guard against it.
Well, we sure do. I'll send you an article from the New York Times that documents this. And this is what they're expecting Trump to do. They're expecting he is now going to favor them, not so much fundamentalists, but the certain group of fundamentalists. And I'm very unhappy about this, obviously, because when you lose church and state, then we lose our country, period.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And that, I know, unfortunately, I don't think Trump cares about that, but he wants to pay off those fundamentalists and those people that that supported him. So I'll send you a copy of that.
Well, it's really kind of funny because when my wife and I were writing Armageddon Now, the End of the World A to Z, we were involved in the whole political movement of religion and politics moving in a funny way. I was I was always kind of surprised when the evangelical church turned against Jimmy Carter because he was one of theirs.
What a guy! That's so foolish to turn against him. What a kind person. I mean, geez,
I was up. I had a chance to send him a book that I had written because I told this story in the book. I was up on a little island called North Haven Island up in Maine, and I was up there for 3 weeks in the summertime filling in for the pastor, and it was a great gig. I could live in the parsonage, and all I had to do was preach on Sundays, and unless something, terrible happened or people needed help, pastoral help during the week. Well, on Saturday night, word went around the island that Jimmy and Rosalind Carter and Cyrus Vance had landed on the island, and they were staying at a good friend of theirs. Now, on North Haven Island is up in Penobscot Bay. It's a very little island, and it only had 2 churches. It had a little Baptist church that was only open in the summertime. That's where I was preaching, and it was only open in the summertime because there was no heat in it. And then there was the Episcopal church downtown. And I thought, 2 churches on the island Saturday night, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter are here. I've got him. So I really worked on my sermon that night. I got rid of anything that might have been considered politically offensive, and I knew that he was a Bible teacher, and he would stick to the Bible, and he would know my references. And so I really worked on that sermon, and I was set. I was ready to go. And on that Sunday morning, I walked out, standing in the front thing, and out and down come this cavalcade of cars, and sitting in the back seat was Jimmy Carter. He was staying with a staunch Episcopalian who worshipped the Episcopalian church, and Jimmy Carter, being a good house guest right to the end, was going to the Episcopal church that day. So I didn't get him at the Baptist church, but I stood up in the pulpit on that Sunday, and our church was packed because everybody on the island figured that Jimmy and Rosalind would be at the Baptist church, so we were packed that Sunday. And I said, I learned something from this. I said, I really worked on this sermon. I really prepared it because I thought that President Carter was going to be here. And then he's down at the Episcopal church. I just saw him go by. And I said, and I realized, why did I work so hard? Jimmy Carter was going to be here. I should have worked this hard whether he was going to be here or not. You don't, because you deserve it. And I should realize it doesn't matter who's in the congregation. I should work this hard every Sunday. And it was quite a moving thing. And after the service was over, one of the deacons came up and shook my hand. He had tears in his eyes, and he said, "Jimmy Carter must be a great teacher, a great man," because he said, "I learned a great thing from him today, and he wasn't even here."
Oh, well, he's a great man. There's no doubt about it. He's a great man.
Yeah.
And I was so sorry to see what happened to him in the elections afterward, because the Republicans at that time were going to trash him no matter what.
Yeah.
And that's
it was a tough time. It was a tough time.
Yeah. Now, most people are very busy, or pretty busy these days, just trying to make a living. Why is it important that we study things that happened so long ago?
I have come to believe that our ancestors had a wisdom that we have lost. I think we can learn some tremendous things from people who came before and civilizations who came before. I think they had a tremendous zeal. I can't imagine what kind of theological thinking was going through the heads, for instance, of the people who built Stonehenge. Why did they have to move those great blue stones hundreds of miles across the countryside? Why did they need those particular stones to put in place? There must have been some kind of a real good reason for it, for them to devote so much time and so much effort into that kind of thing. And I think it had to be their spirituality, their religion, kind of sloshed over onto their daily life. It was a part of it. They were willing to give up all of this energy and all of this time and all of this effort because they believed in something that was big, and they believed in something that was important to them, and that reached down and guided the way they lived their lives. I think we could use some of that today.
Yeah, sure.
I think we have become so secular that we have lost the purpose that pushes us forward. Because I think the great questions we ask, who are we and why are we here, those are spiritual questions. And I'm not talking about being an advocate for any particular religion. I'm talking about a spiritual reality that says we are more than our bodies. We are more than ourselves. The ancient Hindus, I think, did something wonderful about this. When they talked about God, they used two words. The first word was Brahman. And Brahman is a word that cannot be explained. Brahman is that undefinable source that we call God, or we call the source, or we call the source of all that is, or something like that. You can't describe Brahman. It is too big for words. Words were only invented to describe what's here in this life. But they also had another word for God that they used, and that's Atman. And Atman is within. The English word that comes closest to it, I think, is soul. And the beauty of Hinduism and the ancient rishis, when they talked about Atman within and Brahman without, they used to say, thou art that. The great unknowable, the great mystery, the great impossible that's out there is also within us. And I think the ancient people understood this, and it guided their lives. And somehow we've forgotten it. And so our lives have lost meaning, and they've lost purpose. We've lost direction. We don't know who we are, where we're going anymore. Mm-hmm. And our interest is more in the next technological marvel. And I think it's got us in trouble. And I think that's what we have to regain.
Well, I don't think people pray very much anymore, and I don't think a lot of younger people right now are meditating, and I'm so happy to see that.
Yeah, me too.
And soon they're going to learn that, obviously, they're young and alive, and they're going to need to help serve others and help others. Yeah. That's going to be really key.
And our connection with consciousness, that's what it's all about. I think, when we talk about, I almost hesitate to use the word God nowadays because it has so much baggage, negative baggage for so many people, and I understand that. But we don't have another word to replace it. Lately I've been talking about spirit, or I've been talking about consciousness. We are a part of something that is so much bigger than we are. And I think we need to recapture that. We've lost it, and I think we can see it around us, and I think it's a terrible thing.
Hey, by the way, when you went to Egypt, I think you mentioned in the book some of the new discoveries, but something that's just came out a couple of days ago, about a week ago, was the discovery of a very large opening, a hole of some sort, of series of rooms that have been found that are above the 190-foot point, just below the notch at the top of there. So this is really exciting because you know what they think is going to be there. It's just going to be so good to finally get to the point where Casey is going to be corroborated in certain areas. Yeah.
It's so exciting there. That whole that Giza complex, when you stand there, you've stood there and you know what it's like, but when you stand there and look at that, you wonder what it took to mobilize the number of people and what they were thinking and why they were thinking it. And it's a perfect example of your secular life and your spiritual life coming together. I think we were meant to be spiritual beings as well as secular beings. And when we lose that, we lose a lot. You said that you were down in Luxor?
Oh, yes.
We were planning on going down there, and we knew that something was up because the word went out. We were in Cairo, and we were supposed to go down to Luxor the next day. We knew that something had come up. We didn't know what, but they wouldn't let us go, and they were collecting all of the Americans together, for instance, and putting us all in and saying, well, we're going to wait and put it off. And it was only a couple of days later that we discovered that the reason we couldn't go down there was because the day we were supposed to go to Luxor, there was an attack on a Japanese tour bus that was down there, led by a man by the name of Osama bin Laden.
Oh,
and And the United States government was trying to figure out whether they're going to try to bring all of us Americans out of Egypt or not. And so I never got a chance to go down to Luxor. I consider it a great. I'm really sorry that it didn't work out.
Oh, it's so much. I like being in Luxor more than being up in Cairo.
Yeah.
And you know all the horns and all of the people that, et cetera, and everyone wants to sell you everything in the whole wide world. And sometimes you can get some good stuff sometimes. But right now we got to take another break. This isn't our final break, though, right? No, it isn't. With our guest, Jim Willis, Lost Civilizations, The Secret Histories, and Suppressed Technologies of the Ancients, Visible Ink Press. JimWillis.net.
Hi, I'm Glenn Kreisberg, author of Spirits in Stone and co-founder of the Overlook Mountain Center in Woodstock, New York, overlookmountain.org, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus. Keep listening.
Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Jim Willis is our guest. Lost Civilizations is the book. The Secret Histories and Suppressed Technologies of the Ancients, Visible Ink Press. Jim?
Yes.
Could you take one particular civilization and talk about it in regards to our emphasis on it tonight?
Yeah. Let's go to...
There was an island. Remember that island? Oh, Lord.
The island Atlantis, you mean?
No. Hey, well, let's talk about Atlantis then.
Okay.
Okay, how about that?
Well, it's funny. It's hard to mention Atlantis because if you do, you're going to get laughed out of the next symposium. Atlantis is just not considered a real thing by scholars, and yet. For a long time, I thought Atlantis was just a story, a made-up story, and of course I studied philosophy, so I studied Plato, and heard what he said about it. But I was always troubled by something, and that was that if Atlantis was just a made-up story, he did some things that didn't seem to fit. If he was just going to use it as a metaphor. For one thing, he gave it a specific date. I won't go into all the details, but he talked about his ancestor Solon and how many years it was when how many years old the story was when Solon heard it, and then we know how many years from Solon to Plato. And so he gave it a specific date that came out to about 12,800 years ago. And I thought, if this is just a metaphor, why did Plato want to date it so commonly, 12,800 years ago? The other thing, he gave so much detail, much more than was needed to just make a point with one of his students as they're presented to us in the dialogues. And I'm just wondering if he was making this just to be a story to teach a lesson. Why did he fill it up with all these details about human hubris and about what happened and how the gods brought them down and all this kind of thing? So even though I accepted the fact, because I was an academic and I was supposed to think this way, even though I accepted the fact that, well, Atlantis was obviously just a legend and we don't have to pay it too much attention, it didn't seem really to fit. He gave it a specific date, he gave it a specific location, and he gave details about how it happened. And I said, I wonder why he did all that. Well, now it turns out I have a totally different story. I think he was describing a real lost civilization. We call Atlantis, I like to call it the Atlantis Tradition, because there's a lot of other evidence about it now. But the date is important that Plato gave, because the date corresponds exactly to when what was probably a segmented comet exploded not only in the atmosphere over the Earth 12,800 years ago. It was called the Younger Dryas Comet, but also the damage that it did and what happened at that time. We have a tremendous amount of physical evidence that something drastic happened to planet Earth 12,800 years ago. The Earth at that time was just nicely retreating out of the last ice age. Spring was coming back to the Earth, and all of a sudden something happened, and it's of course debated, but I think the evidence is becoming overwhelming that it was that comet hit, that comet explosion. And at that time, all kinds of things happened. The mammoths and the great megafauna went extinct. There was the Clovis culture went extinct here in this country. A new ice age broke on the Earth all over the place. It lasted for about 1,600 years until 1,200 years. The Earth went back into a deep freeze again. And when all of this hits, you begin to wonder, could there have been a civilization at that time that was very advanced and that was destroyed by this comet? Now, it probably wouldn't have destroyed everyone. There would have been those who were out and about and that would have escaped the destruction, but their homeland would have been gone, their culture would have been gone. And at that very time, 11,600 years ago, after the last ice age, we talk about the sea level suddenly rising and everything else, but that's precisely the time when Göbekli Tepe was built. Now, the big question about Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is, how did these hunter-gatherers just wake up one day and decide to do this fantastic structure called Göbekli Tepe? Nobody knows. But one possibility is that there was an Ice Age culture, which I like to call in the Atlantis tradition, that had been destroyed, and I could very easily see these people setting out in different parts around the world, going to the Levant, going to Turkey, going to Egypt, and spreading their culture and teaching the hunter-gatherers who had survived the explosion, trying to jumpstart the old culture, so to speak. Now, these people would probably now be looked back, and they would be considered to be gods, because they were just human. They weren't gods, but they would probably be considered that because they were so much farther advanced than the hunter-gatherers who were there. The Egyptian culture even has stories about the Zep Tepi, or the first time, when these mysterious strangers came in their great ships from the west and came to Egypt and told the people how to begin the culture in Egypt. And these were the primary gods of the Egyptian culture. It all seems to fit together. It all comes together. I've probably covered much too much ground in too short a time, but it's enough to make me convinced that the Atlantis tradition could very well have some real historical background to it.
You have a very, very interesting chapter on Antarctica.
Yeah.
So what are we finding now? Have you ever listened to a radio station called the Gaia?
Yes, I have.
Gaia, and television, actually, yeah. But then that's where I was first introduced to this idea about Antarctica and Atlantis.
Yeah. Charles Hapgood had some interesting things to say
sure
about
did,
that too. When he discovered the ancient map that actually showed the Antarctica coastline, and it actually showed the shape of the continent of Antarctica. And we can say, how can that possibly be? Because according to geology, as long as human beings have been on this earth, Antarctica has been under ice. No one could have possibly seen it. It wasn't even discovered until much later in time. And Hapgood had the idea about the Earth crust actually moving and shifting in place. He wrote to Albert Einstein about it, and Einstein was intrigued. He wrote back to him and said he was really fascinated by the whole idea. And the idea was, of course, we all know that the crust of the Earth is moving all the time normally, but can there be an event that happens that causes a sudden crust shift? And could Antarctica have been in a warmer climate, been farther north, and that whole plate that it rides on, that whole crust that it rides on, for some reason, and it could have been, the explosion of a comet that just really shook the whole Earth or whatever, did it in effect slide down so that all the ferns and things that they're discovering, in Antarctica, that they're right now fossilized ferns, and we say, if Antarctica has always been at the southern polar region, how did forests grow there? How did ferns grow there? Mm-hmm. And Hapgood had the whole idea of this continental shift, crustal shift, that said maybe Antarctica was once in a warmer climate. Maybe it was Atlantis. That was his question. And he never said this is the way it was. He just raised the question. And I think there's a real interesting thing to study there.
It sure is. And I also wanted to thank you for mentioning Captain Mallory in regards to this particular area, because most people, he's not known too well. Have you ever heard of a guy named Christopher Bird who wrote The Secret Life of Plants?
I've heard of him. I don't know much about him at all, no.
Well, he was the best man at my wedding. We were friends.
Oh, really?
And so the reason why I'm bringing it up, it was he that kept relating to me, you got to read Mallory. You got to read these other people as well. And fortunate, I think his name was Captain Arlington Mallory. Yes, and so I was so thrilled to see his name in there, because so many times I'd like to know who was it first, who was it that really got into this that most people don't know about, and teach those other people, like a guy like Charles Hapgood, say for instance.
It takes a tremendous amount of courage to stand up to your colleagues and peers in your field. And one of the sad things that when I was researching lost civilizations, one of the saddest things I discovered was story after story after story of people who had good ideas and who put them out there and were simply blackballed and lost their living. And it's just an absolute terrible thing how they were treated. And it's still going on today. It's not enough to destroy a man's argument. Now you have to try to destroy his character. And I think that's terrible. A lot of people went to their graves thinking that they were totally disgraced. Only years later, after they had died, did they discover that their ideas were particularly were intriguing and were found. And I think it's something that has to change, but it's human nature, I'm afraid. I sure don't like it.
Well, thank you for introducing me to Hugh Everett.
Hugh Everett was a classic example. Here was the guy who came up with the whole idea of the multiverse.
Yes.
And he was blackballed from physics. He died terrible death. And now Max Tegart at MIT. And now Hugh Everett is one of his idols, and Hugh Everett was right. He was right all along that this is a very real possibility. But Hugh Everett died thinking that he was a total failure, thinking that he had been totally disgraced. What a terrible, terrible thing that happened to him.
Indeed. Wow. Okay. What do we mean by civilization?
Oh, this is, talk about an argument. Gordon Childe came up, he was the one who coined the term Neolithic Revolution, the same thing as the Agricultural Revolution. And years ago, he put down the idea of what a civilization is. And he came up with the idea that there were primary characteristics and secondary characteristics. And what he called the primary characteristics of a civilization is urban settlements and full-time specialists who were not involved in agriculture, concentration of surplus production, and a class structure, and state-level organization or government. Those are the primary characteristics of a civilization. The secondary characteristics were these monumental building, public building projects, and extensive trade networks that went far afield, and standardized monumental artwork, and the development of writing, and the development of sciences. And that is the definition that most people accept today when they talk about civilization. I had a problem with that when I was writing Lost Civilization, because basically what that definition does is it defines civilization in the past by comparing it with our own. In other words, we assume that our civilization is the way a civilization is supposed to look. Mm-hmm. And I had trouble with that. That eliminates people who I think had a wonderful community, and like the Neanderthal and Denisovan. So my own definition of civilization is any group of people who come together over a period of time, and they demonstrate a capacity for what I like to call uniquely human qualities that distinguish them from their ancestors, their animal ancestors especially. These qualities could be things like shared moral values, or technology, or an appreciation for beauty and art, or a spiritual yearning for meaning in the face of our limited lifespans, a search for ultimate reality. That's the definition that I use, because we find these people like Neanderthal, for instance, who are not considered civilized at all, and yet they had musical instruments, they had art, they must have believed in an afterlife because they buried their dead with tools, stone tools. And why would they bury somebody with stone tools unless they figured they'd need them in the next life? That means religion. So when you put all those together, I think there's a lot of groups of people back then that could be called civilization, as long as we just don't think that our civilization is the only way to do it. So that's what I mean by civilization anyway.
Thank you. And we need to take our final break here on 21st Century Radio with Jim Willis, Lost Civilizations, Secret Histories, and Suppressed Technologies of the Ancients, Visible Ink Press.
This is Carl Lerberger, author of Secrets of Ancient America, www.newhistoryofamerica.com, and I invite you to continue listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
Hey, welcome back to 21st Century Radio in our last segment. Are you with us, Jim?
I am here.
Okay, Jim. How, where, and why do civilizations arise?
The traditional answer is that wherever people gather, for instance, rivers, the Nile of Egypt, the Tigris and the Euphrates in the Mesopotamia, the Mississippi River here in the United States was a great place for civilization, the Yellow River of China. Rivers are sources they're places of resources, and they're highways, and they're places, so that was the traditional place, but also an agricultural land. For instance, the Fertile Crescent that swings from Mesopotamia all the way up through Turkey and back down through the Levant or through into Israel. The Ohio River Valley, again, here in this country. That's the traditional understanding, rivers and agricultural land. You had to have that to have a civilization. But the trouble is that doesn't go far enough. There are places on this earth that have produced civilizations, and nobody can figure out why. They're far removed from resources. Göbekli Tepe, for instance. There's no water around there to speak of. There was no agriculture at that time. Why did people go there? In Peru, the Nazca lines. Why did people want to make those tremendous lines up in Peru? That must have taken a sophisticated civilization way up there in the mountains, on the top of the mountains. And mountains look like they've just been flattened right down. And there's no resources up there. There's no way to feed people up there and everything else. Or maybe, possibly the people just could have felt something in the landscape. So when they talk about rivers and agricultural land, I like to add a third category, and that's earth energies. I think the people felt something, and they were responding to an energy that was in the ground. Earlier you were talking about a rock having a consciousness of sorts. I think people could feel that, and they realized we had to be here, even though it might be convenient. We may have to go farther for water. We may have to go farther to find game. But there's a reason. They felt a spiritual energy, a connection with the land at a certain place. So I like to add that third category, earth energies. That's how. Why do civilizations arise? I think they arise whenever people come gathering together. We are a communal people. And whenever people gather together for a communal purpose, whenever they have a signal purpose, I think the potential of having a civilization is there.
Oh, thank you. What makes a civilization fall or fail?
Oh, that's a good question. In the book, I developed I think it was 6 different.
That's right. Yeah, you did.
Different ideas. The first was catastrophe. A civilization can fall because something happens. We already talked about the Younger Dryas impact in North America that ended the Clovis culture. The Centauria, the volcano, Centauria, the eruption in Crete. Many people think that was associated with Atlantis. I personally don't think that was the Atlantis. I don't place Atlantis in the Mediterranean. I place it outside where Plato did. Off the coast of India, there's all kinds of evidence of civilization that were flooded because of the catastrophe when the ocean levels came. Or beneath the Black Sea, there's a lot of buildings that have been discovered, but they were drowned out by the catastrophe. Another reason, I think, is just plain old economics or internal strife. The ancestral Puebloans, we used to call them Anasazi, went extinct, and nobody knows why. But probably the reason had to do with the fact that their economic structure fell apart. They burned all their firewood. There was no more wood. There was no water. They had to go farther and farther afield, and they got arguing with one another, and this is mine, and that's yours, and I want what you've got, and everything else, and they can fall apart. War, of course, destroys civilizations. A classic example, I think, is how the North American military, within 10 years, destroyed the Plains culture, the Indians out there, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Arapaho, the Apache. They went out there and just deliberately tried to destroy that civilization that had lived there for thousands of years, because they did it by attacking the food supply. They burned the corn. They slaughtered the buffalo and just made it impossible for civilization to go. You hate to say this, but you have to blame religion too.
Yeah.
The Spanish, the Christian conquistadors in Central America and Peru, they were using religion to come along and destroy those civilizations, and they did. And they burned the texts, and they burned the villages, and they enslaved the people. Sometimes civilizations are just assimilated. In Mesopotamia, there was a great civilization. Nobody knows where it came from to begin with, but the Sumerians came along and assimilated the Mesopotamians, and then the Babylonians came and assimilated the Sumerians and the Persians, and that was followed by the Assyrians, and right into the present day, one culture just comes along and assimilates the culture that was there before it. And, of course, we have to go to climate change. That's another reason that civilizations fall. North Africa used to be a lush forest. When the Sphinx was built, the Sphinx has water damage on it. It was raining.
Oh,
there.
You did a wonderful section in your book on the Sphinx. Congratulations. There are so many good areas here that we couldn't cover anywhere near them. Like, destroy a person's religion and you destroy their civilization.
Yeah.
Oh, geez, whiz. I learned so much from you, and I greatly appreciate this.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's nice to know that we can get together and talk like this, and you're doing great work because you allow this kind of conversation to go to such a wider audience, and I really appreciate the work you do.
Well, it's a karmic job. It's a karmic job because obviously we do not get paid.
Yeah.
We pay for this show.
Yeah.
And that way we are free to talk about what we need to talk about. Yeah. And it's mighty expensive to do so. But it's an important thing we felt to render some service to our location, the people within our state. And, well, actually, it's heard in several states. So,
well, it is much appreciated, I assure you.
Well, we only got 5 minutes left. What do you think is the single most important cultural problem we face today when it comes to regaining what you think the ancients experienced, but we have forgotten?
Yeah, I think the big thing we have to learn is that I forgot who it was that first said it. I think it was Socrates who said, "Beware the barrenness of a busy life." Today we are so busy.
Yes.
Back in the ancient times, believe it or not, even though life may have been harder in so many ways, people had more time. The vast majority of people, I'm sure, including and especially people in positions of power and authority today, they're living on the surface rather than digging into the mystery. I think life is a great mystery. And if once we do that, we begin to relate to the illusion rather than the reality. And I think most of us are living a life where we are seeing only the illusion. We assume that life exists as we see it and as we experience it. And I think it's much bigger than that. And the old-timers, the ancients, they had the time to go out at night, and they didn't just turn on the television and look for entertainment. They sat around the fire, or they stared at the stars, and they listened to the wisdom of the old people, and they had a chance to think. Life was slower. Even in my generation's day, my grandfather would hook up the wagon, and we'd all pile in the back, and we would drive the wagon into town, and we would sing songs together, or we would just talk, and we would discuss. Or coming home after dark, we'd look up without lights all over the place. We would see that sky just filled with stars, and it had tremendous spiritual importance to us. Nowadays, it's just running from this and running from that. I find myself thinking about this as an ex-teacher. We prepare our kids in elementary school. We prepare them for high school. Then we prepare them for maybe college or maybe a job. And as soon as you get the job, you start preparing for your retirement. And then you get to your retirement, and you start preparing for, we're always looking ahead. And I just think it's really important to study these ancient civilizations, these lost civilizations, because we have to regain something that they had and that we've forgotten.
Is our civilization in danger of joining the list of lost civilizations?
Well, if we're not, we'll be the first one to never go down that route.
That's one way of putting it, all right?
I think yes. I see some real. I think we stand at a crisis moment right now in human history, and I'm not just talking about the United States of America. I'm talking about civilization as we know it, because there really is a world civilization right now. You can go to China and eat at McDonald's, and when you can go to Cairo and get a Hardee's, or that kind of thing. Yeah, we're talking about Walmart in Beijing. We're talking about a one world civilization right now. We are so connected, and I think as a civilization we are facing a very serious crisis point. We can either go the way of the material world, which seems to be the way we're going, or we can go deeper into the spirit, like you were talking about earlier, and begin to think about our obligation to each other. I think that there's a choice that we're facing right now. Are we going to become materialistic beings and all that's involved in that, or are we going to become spiritual beings who are involved in the bigger questions of life about morality and ethics and love and compassion and all of those words that mean so much?
And with that, we got to say goodbye. Thank you very much, Jim Willis. Lost Civilizations, The Secret Histories and Suppressed Technologies of the Ancients, Visibling Press. All links are at 21stcenturyradio.com. Find our archive audio series for free.